In this lesson, we're going to look at cycling. And before we get into cycling, I want to talk to you about a few key terms. These two down here at the bottom are ones that I think you're pretty familiar with, biotic and abiotic factor. I think we're good there. But when you talk about cycling, there's two new terms that come up, sink and pump. And it's important to understand what those are. A sink is also called a store. Okay, so what you need to understand is this is a place that's going to store either carbon, and these are notes from Carbon Cycle, by the way. So, we can be talking about carbon cycle or carbon, but also nitrogen or water. So whatever cycling ends up in a store or a sink for a period of time and stays there. A pump is something that moves the thing that we're trying to move, either carbon or nitrogen or water, through the ecosystem. So you have sinks and pumps, and these are going to kind of make the cycle happen. All right, we're going to start with the water cycle. Okay, so it's important that we start with the water cycle because the water cycle is one that you're familiar with from middle school, but also it's a good one to use for comparison when we're learning about nitrogen and carbon. So when you learned about the water cycle, you learned about its shuns, right? The condensation, evaporation, percolation, precipitation, etc., right? There might be one that you hadn't learned about in middle school, but we learned about transpiration, right? And they call it evapotranspiration, but that's transpiration. So the water cycle is not difficult, but the thing about the water cycle is that it's the easiest and least complex of all the cycles in ecosystems. So what I want you to pay attention to here is, first of all, it's always water, okay? Water, no matter whether it's in the atmosphere or whether it's in the oceans or whether it's in groundwater, is always H2O, okay? It's always staying water. There's no chemical transformation that takes place. All that happens is you get state changes in this cycle. So you go from, say, liquid water here in the ocean to gaseous water in the atmosphere, and then it condenses down back into the atmosphere and making clouds and so on. The other thing that you need to notice here is that the water cycle is completely fueled by the sun, and if there was nothing living on the planet, water would cycle on its own, and for that reason we say that water is a primarily abiotically driven cycle. So stuff cycles on its own with the water cycle just from the energy of the sun, and not because of any living thing. The only part of the water cycle that's responsible or that's done by anything living is transpiration. Okay, but if transpiration didn't exist, look at all the ways that water would continue to move around the ecosystem. Okay, so this is primarily an abiotically driven cycle. All right, now we're going to compare this to the carbon cycle. Okay, now carbon is slightly different. Notice, first of all, carbon in the atmosphere is in carbon dioxide or CO, carbon monoxide. When it gets moved to plants through photosynthesis, you know, based on what you learned back in Unit 3, that what you end up with is C6H12O6, or glucose. So that carbon that started out as CO2 gets converted through photosynthesis into sugars. Okay, so now you're starting to see a chemical change that carbon goes through as it moves from one step to the next in the cycle. Okay, notice also what'll happen is once that carbon, that sugar gets passed on to organisms, the organisms are going to convert it back into CO2, right? Plants are going to convert it back into CO2 and so on. So you get chemical changes. The other massive chemical change that you're going to get is combustion. Okay, combustion is going to take carbon-containing compounds when we burn them, and it's going to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's a chemical change. Okay, that's a combustion reaction, which is a chemical change. Notice also how many ways there are to take carbon out of the atmosphere. You've got photosynthesis, and you've got ocean uptake, and that's it. Okay, 2 ways that carbon comes out of the atmosphere. But look at all the ways that carbon goes into the atmosphere. And this one's a big one because it's got a lot involved in that. You know, there's a lot of individuals producing, because of combustion, carbon for the atmosphere. All right, so that's the carbon cycle. The other thing you want to note here is that photosynthesis is also called carbon fixation. Okay, carbon fixation. What that means is you take carbon in a non-usable form, carbon dioxide, and you convert it to sugars which are usable to living things. Okay, so fixing a compound like carbon dioxide means that you're taking it from a non-usable form and converting it into a usable form. Another thing to bear in mind, and this is just kind of review from Unit 3, is that photosynthesis and respiration are major carbon pumps, and they kind of work as their own little mini cycle within the carbon cycle, because, and this, you know, we had this in our notes before, but you've got plants producing oxygen and glucose, the plants taking in that oxygen and also eating the sugars from the plants, and converting that into carbon dioxide and also releasing water. And that carbon dioxide goes back into the plants. Plants can also release oxygen to themselves and carbon dioxide to themselves because they can do both of these processes. But you have this mini pump cycle within the carbon cycle as well. So these are important processes for moving carbon around. There are, of course, other carbon pumps. Combustion, okay, this is a big one because of energy needs, okay. Human beings have relied for a long time on carbon combustion for our energy, our powering vehicles, powering factories, getting electricity, stuff like that. And because we have a big population in our world, and that the population is growing, and everybody needs energy, you're getting a lot of carbon being put into the atmosphere. There are some natural ways that carbon goes into the atmosphere, death and decay, but also volcanic activity. Volcanoes put out a tremendous amount of carbon when they erupt. Okay, so they're also responsible for it. They're not responsible for the buildup of carbon that we're seeing in the atmosphere now, but they at least do put carbon into the atmosphere. All right, in terms of carbon sinks, this is places, again, where carbon is going to get stuck. The two biggest carbon sinks or carbon stores are the atmosphere and the ocean. Okay, these are places where carbon gets stuck and often can stay for quite a long time, especially in ocean sediments and ocean water that's been frozen. So the polar ice caps, for example, store an awful lot of carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide gets trapped in the water and that water gets frozen and then the carbon can't get released. Unfortunately, as those polar ice caps melt, they're releasing more and more carbon into the atmosphere. So that's another problem with global warming. But those are the two biggest carbon sinks. There's other carbon sinks. You've got soil, molecules of living things. So basically, you're a carbon sink when you think about it. It's just that you're a short-term carbon sink. So the length of time that carbon spends in one of the sinks is dependent upon the sink itself. All right, so carbon cycle. You see chemical changes with carbon as carbon cycles. The same thing is going to happen here with our nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen starts out as nitrogen gas. It's going to enter the living things. It's going to get fixed by bacteria, which are going to convert it to ammonia and then nitrates. Okay, so ammonia and nitrates. So again, you're seeing chemical changes as you go through. And also, just like the carbon cycle, notice what's doing the movement of carbon here are bacteria, decomposers, plants, and animals, right? So both the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle are biotically driven cycles. All right, and that's another important thing to note about these cycles. All right, so let's look at the nitrogen cycle. This one is even further complicated. And the reason why it's further complicated is because you've just got a bunch of steps. Instead of it going through one transformation before it's usable, often nitrogen has to go through two. So most of the time, nitrogen enters the soil and bacteria ammonify it. In other words, they convert that nitrogen into ammonia. And then nitrifying bacteria will actually convert that into nitrites. And then more bacteria will convert that into nitrates. And the nitrates are what are fertilizers for plants. So that's the assimilation, is where the plants take up these nitrates and use it as fertilizer. Then the plants can pass that nitrogen on to animals through the food chain. Okay, now it's really important that we have nitrogen, right? Because nitrogen is a component of proteins, and remember how much proteins do inside of your system. And also, nitrogen is part of nucleic acids as well. Now, that nitrogen can be released via the action of decomposers, okay, and become ammonia again. Animals, when they urinate, they release ammonia into the soil, okay? So there's constantly nitrogen making its way into the soil. So to get rid of excess nitrogen, you have what's called denitrifying bacteria. They can actually take excess nitrogen from the soil and can re-release it to the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. Now, there's one other step that we haven't mentioned. There's this special kind of relationship where you have nitrogen-fixing bacteria that can live in these little tiny bumps that you see on the roots of very special plants, legumes. These are the bean plants. These root nodules contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Those bacteria can actually convert the nitrogen in a single step into usable nitrates for the legumes only. Okay, so only some plants do that. Most of the time you have other organisms that have to convert it through several steps. The last thing that's not showing up here is that nitrogen can actually be fixed not only by bacteria, but there's actually an abiotic way to fix nitrogen, and that is using lightning in the atmosphere. Whenever there's lightning in the atmosphere, some nitrogen gets converted immediately from nitrogen gas.